It was May 1945. The Third Reich, once believed to be invincible, had crumbled into dust. Across the shattered remains of Europe, the men who once commanded Hitler's mighty armies now stood as prisoners, defeated, disillusioned, and terrified. German generals who had lived their lives in luxury and authority now awaited their fate in the chaos of post-war Europe. Many expected execution. They had seen what had happened to their comrades captured by the Soviets: endless interrogations, torture, and the black hole of Siberian camps. The Allies had made it clear: war criminals would be punished. But deep inside, these men wondered, would the Americans show mercy, or would they hang us all? Among them was General Friedrich von Mellenthin, an officer who had fought across North Africa and the Eastern Front. Beside him, General Dietrich von Choltitz, the man who had refused to destroy Paris. There was also Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, old, proud, and broken. As Allied jeeps rolled into the shattered remains of German cities, these once powerful figures were herded into captivity like common soldiers. Their medals were stripped, their papers taken, and they were transported in trucks bearing the White Star of the United States Army. What they didn't yet realize was that their journey from fear of execution to astonishment at American treatment was about to become one of the most unexpected stories of post-war honor and humanity. The generals were taken to Camp Ashcan, a secret Allied holding facility in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, established to contain the highest-ranking members of the Nazi military and government. It wasn't a typical prison. It was a former luxury spa resort hastily converted into a high-security camp surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps. Inside were some of the most infamous men in modern history: Goering, Keitel, Jodl, and a host of generals who had commanded millions. The mood was one of despair. Many believed they would be executed without trial. Others prepared suicide capsules they had hidden in their uniforms.
But what awaited them was something far different from what they imagined. Unlike the brutal Soviet prison camps or the vengeful scenes unfolding in Eastern Europe, the Americans had orders, strict ones, to treat their captives humanely, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The goal was clear: maintain discipline, extract intelligence, and, most importantly, understand the German military mindset. So while these German generals expected to be shot or starved, they were instead given clean uniforms, medical attention, and food rations that astonished them. Meals included white bread, butter, even coffee, luxuries Germany hadn't seen in months. The U.S. wanted to win something even greater than the war: the moral high ground. And this moral high ground, in time, would completely break through the arrogance of the captured German elite. In the first few days, disbelief reigned. General von Rundstedt, accustomed to strict decorum, refused to speak to his captors. Mellenthin suspected a trick. He believed the Americans were fattening them up for interrogation or propaganda. But slowly,
As days turned to weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The Americans treated them not as monsters, but as men. They allowed them to write letters home, provided them with reading material, and even permitted light conversation with their guards. These weren't soft soldiers. These were battle-hardened American GIs who had fought their way through Europe. Yet, many of them respected their prisoners' rank and discipline. For the first time, the German generals saw a kind of respect that had long disappeared from their own crumbling regime. As the sun set behind the ruined cities of Europe, the generals sat together in the camp courtyard, talking quietly about the past, about the Führer who had promised them glory and instead led them to ruin. Some defended him, others cursed his name, but all agreed on one thing. They had expected execution. Instead, they had found an unexpected lesson in decency. And that realization was only the beginning.
The first morning inside Camp Ashcan came with silence, broken only by the distant sound of trucks and guards calling orders. The German generals woke expecting humiliation, perhaps forced labor, interrogation, or public shaming. Instead, they were met with something that completely disarmed them: American efficiency and unexpected civility. Breakfast was served promptly: oatmeal, coffee, a boiled egg, and even a small piece of fruit. For men who had lived on watery soup and stale bread during the final months of the war, it felt surreal. General Wilhelm Keitel, once head of the German High Command, stared at his tray and whispered, "We treated our prisoners worse than this." It was a quiet admission, but others heard it. It echoed through the camp like a confession of guilt. The Americans running Camp Ashcan weren't ordinary guards. They were intelligence officers, fluent in German, trained psychologists, and skilled interrogators who understood something crucial. Breaking the enemy didn't always require force. Sometimes it required decency. They made it clear that the generals were not there to be punished. Not yet. They were there to be understood. Each general was interviewed individually, not with threats, but with questions designed to probe their loyalty, beliefs, and knowledge of Nazi command. They were asked about Hitler's mental state in his final days, about secret weapons programs, about the morale of the Wehrmacht. But beyond the questions, the Americans observed their behavior, how they reacted to kindness, how they spoke to guards, how they treated one another now that power was gone. Slowly, the psychological transformation began. The men who had once barked orders in marble-floored headquarters now lined up in orderly fashion for meals. Rank meant little here. Field marshal or lieutenant, all stood in the same queue, under the same watchful eyes. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, who had signed countless orders sending men to their deaths, now folded his blanket every morning to military perfection, trying to preserve some fragment of dignity.
But dignity, they began to realize, didn't come from fear or obedience. It came from discipline and decency, the very virtues they saw in their captors.
One of the guards, a young American sergeant named Robert "Bobby" Hayes from Chicago, became a quiet legend in the camp. He treated every prisoner the same, polite, firm, and fair. When one German officer refused to eat because he thought the food was poisoned, Hayes sat across from him and ate the same meal to prove it wasn't. From that moment, the officer saluted him every morning. The Americans didn't preach democracy to their prisoners, they demonstrated it. Clean barracks, medical inspections, and equal treatment regardless of rank or background. Even the doctors, mostly Jewish refugees serving in U.S. uniform, treated wounded or sick German generals with compassion. For the first time, the architects of a brutal regime came face to face with the humanity they had long denied others. By midsummer 1945, the fear of execution had faded. In its place was confusion and reflection. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, reportedly told another officer, "They are not the barbarians we said they were." These were men trained to believe in German superiority, to see other nations as weak. But at Ashcan, superiority had a new meaning, moral, not racial. Even the camp's physical setting reinforced that. The walls still bore traces of the luxury spa it once was, chandeliers hanging beside barbed wire, elegant windows looking out onto guard towers. It was as if history itself was mocking them, showing how civilization and brutality could coexist depending on who held power. In the evenings, some prisoners played chess or wrote in journals. Others debated the future of Germany. Who would rebuild it? What system would rise from the ruins? The Americans allowed it, even encouraged it. They wanted to see what ideas survived after the fall of Nazism. For some, it was the first time they spoke freely, without fear of the Gestapo. The irony was profound. It took captivity under the Americans for them to finally experience freedom of thought. As days passed, word spread through the camp, rumors that trials were being planned in Nuremberg. Fear returned, but this time it was different. The prisoners knew that justice was coming, but they also knew it would be lawful justice, not vengeance. And that distinction, that fragile line between retribution and fairness, became the heart of what changed them. They began to understand that their captors weren't seeking revenge. They were trying to rebuild a world where law replaced hate. And for the first time, some of them began to wonder, had they thought for the wrong side of history all along? As the summer of 1945 turned to autumn, the atmosphere inside Camp Ashcan began to change. The constant hum of Allied vehicles outside, the flow of new documents, and the whispers among guards signaled something monumental was approaching. The German generals, once content to simply survive, now faced a new reality. The trials were coming. They had heard rumors about Nuremberg, a city chosen not just for its symbolism as the birthplace of Nazi rallies, but for the message it would send to the world. Justice would be carried out not in darkness or secrecy, but under the full light of civilization. For men who once believed they would be shot in a ditch, the idea of a fair trial was almost incomprehensible. But the Americans were determined. Every man, from Goering to Jodl to Keitel, would answer for his actions in accordance with law, not vengeance. The day the orders came to transfer the first group of prisoners, the camp fell into eerie silence. Trucks lined up at the gate, guarded by armed MPs. As their names were called, the generals packed what little they had: notebooks, photos, and letters, remnants of lives that felt centuries away. When Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Reichsmarshal, stepped into the sunlight wearing a well-tailored uniform, even the guards couldn't ignore the surreal image. Just months earlier, this man had commanded the Luftwaffe and wielded influence second only to Hitler himself. Now, he was an unarmed prisoner under American custody. As the convoy rolled toward Nuremberg, the generals stared out at the landscape: bombed cities, burned forests, children scavenging for food. It was a Germany they barely recognized. The empire they had served so fanatically was nothing but rubble. Upon arrival at Nuremberg prison, reality struck even harder. The Americans had transformed part of the old Palace of Justice into a fortress of order. Each cell was clean, lit, and guarded. There were no beatings, no shouting. Even here, at the doorstep of judgment, the U.S. Army enforced discipline and fairness. Each prisoner was assigned a number, a cell, and daily routines: breakfast, interrogation, exercise. They were even allowed to attend chapel if they wished. It was not mercy, but structure, the kind of moral order the Nazi system had destroyed. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. You are being held by a nation that believes in justice, not hatred. Still, arrogance died hard. Göring strutted around the corridors, trying to rally other generals, mocking the Americans as naive idealists. Wilhelm Keitel, on the other hand, grew more somber. He confided to one guard, "If we had treated our prisoners like this, maybe we would not have lost our souls." The words carried weight, not just because of who said them, but because of what they revealed: an acknowledgement that the American way of victory was not just military, but moral. The U.S. Guards understood this too. They had fought through hell, Normandy, the Ardennes, Remagen. Yet here they were, guarding the architects of that very nightmare, and still following the rule book. The interrogations at Nuremberg were unlike any the Germans expected. They weren't beaten or tortured. Instead, teams of American, British, and French officers questioned them with precision. Every document, every command, every order signed was examined. And yet, what broke most of these men wasn't the evidence, it was the calm civility of those questioning them. When faced with proof of atrocities, massacres, camps, death marches, some tried to deny, others deflected. But the American interrogators didn't shout. They simply showed photographs, records, testimonies. Silence would fill the room. For the first time, many of these men were forced to confront the truth of what they had served. Not the glorious Wehrmacht propaganda, but the horrifying machinery of genocide and destruction. Outside the prison, American soldiers guarded the perimeter, watching crowds gather as the world prepared to witness the first international war crimes tribunal in history. Inside, the German officers who had once believed themselves untouchable now lived under constant introspection. Some, like Albert Speer, began to express remorse, admitting that the system had consumed them. Others, like Jodl and Ribbentrop, clung to denial. But even denial could not withstand the steady, unshakable discipline of American justice. The trials would not only expose the crimes of a regime, they would redefine what civilization meant after war. At night, from their cells, the generals could hear church bells ringing in the ruins of Nuremberg, faint echoes of a nation trying to find its soul again. For the first time, they were the powerless ones, and the Americans, the victors, had every reason for revenge. But there was none. There was order. There was law, and as each of them lay in their narrow beds, they began to realize something profound. The strength of a nation was not measured by how it fought, but by how it treated those who could no longer fight back. The morning of November 20th, 1945, dawned cold and gray over Nuremberg. The once proud city, now scarred by bombing raids, stood as both a ruin and a stage for history. Inside the Palace of Justice, cameras were set up, translators prepared, and rows of press correspondents from every corner of the world filled the gallery. For the first time in human history, the victors of a world war would put the defeated on trial, not for revenge, but for crimes against humanity. The idea was revolutionary. Never before had generals and ministers been held accountable by law for the decisions that led to mass murder, genocide, and war. For the German prisoners watching the preparations, the reality was almost too much to comprehend. They had expected summary execution, a bullet, a noose, or exile. But here they were, facing justice that was fair, transparent, and meticulously documented. When the guards led the prisoners into the courtroom, the world went silent. Hermann Göring led the procession, his head held high, still trying to project the image of a proud marshal. Behind him came Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Kaltenbrunner, and others whose names had once inspired fear across Europe. They took their seats in the dock,
rows of powerful men reduced to defendants behind glass. The judges entered, representing the four Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. But it was the American chief prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, who would set the tone for history. His opening speech would become one of the most powerful declarations ever spoken in a courtroom. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captives to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Those words hit like thunder. The generals sat in stunned silence. This was not the shouting of victors, nor the rhetoric of propaganda. This was calm, unyielding logic. The Americans had come not to humiliate, but to prove, through evidence, through order, through truth. Over the following months, the courtroom became a theater of morality and justice. Films of concentration camps were shown. Survivors testified. Photographs of mass graves, of skeletal prisoners, of murdered civilians were displayed for all to see. There was no escape, no denial left. Even Goering, once defiant, sat pale and motionless as the horrors of the regime he had built were laid bare. Many of the German generals struggled to process what they were seeing.
They had fought on the front lines, some claiming ignorance of the atrocities. But as the documents piled up, orders signed, names recorded, transports scheduled, it became clear that this was not the work of a few madmen. It was a system, a machine of death, built and maintained by men like them. The Americans didn't raise their voices. They didn't torture confessions out of anyone. They simply showed the truth, and the truth was unbearable. In the quiet moments between sessions, American guards escorted the prisoners back to their cells. Some of the younger guards, veterans of the war themselves, looked at the men they once saw as monsters and felt something unexpected, pity. Not for what they had done, but for how utterly lost they looked. The German officers, stripped of ideology and excuse, were beginning to see the world through a different lens, one that had no place for the myths they had lived by. One guard recalled seeing Field Marshal Keitel weeping alone in his cell after watching footage from the camps. He didn't cry when captured. He cried when he saw what his orders had led to. Justice Jackson's method was simple, yet devastating. He presented facts, methodically, relentlessly, until even the most stubborn defendants were forced to face reality. The Americans had built a case not just against individuals, but against the idea that power excused cruelty. They were building the moral foundation of a new world order. Every detail, the fairness of the proceedings, the translators ensuring every defendant understood his rights, the medical staff ensuring no one was mistreated, stood in contrast to the brutality of the regime on trial. And then came the day the verdicts were read. Goering,
death by hanging; Keitel, death by hanging; Jodl, death by hanging. Others, like Speer, were sentenced to years of imprisonment. But what struck observers most was not the punishments themselves, but the way they were delivered, calmly, lawfully, without anger. Even the executions that followed were carried out quietly, without spectacle. There was no mob, no cheering crowd, no revenge. The world watched in solemn silence as justice was served. When the Americans finally closed the Nuremberg proceedings, the message had been written into history. Civilization had prevailed over barbarism. For the German officers who lived through it, that message would echo for the rest of their lives. They had seen firsthand how a nation could win a war and still choose humanity over hate.
When the Nuremberg trials ended, a new chapter began. Not just for Germany, but for the men who had lived through its darkest age. Those who escaped execution were sent to prisons across Europe. Spandau, Landsberg, and others under Allied control. There, time itself became their judge. For the first time, many of these once mighty generals were left alone with their thoughts. No Führer, no salutes, no applause, just silence. But within that silence, something remarkable began to grow: reflection. Some of them, like Albert Speer, used their years behind bars to write, to question, and to confess. His memoirs spoke openly of guilt, not just for crimes committed, but for blindness, for failing to see what his loyalty had supported. Others, like Friedrich von Mellenthin, would later write about their astonishment at American conduct, admitting that the U.S. had defeated Germany not only with weapons, but with ideals. "We were treated as men," one former officer wrote, "even when we had ceased to deserve it." Those words, simple as they were, marked the beginning of Germany's long road back to humanity. In American hands, even behind barbed wire, many of these men saw a kind of strength they had never known. Strength that came not from fear, but from principle. They realized that while Hitler's Reich had ruled through terror, America had conquered through law. While their own regime demanded obedience through cruelty, the United States demanded discipline through justice. It was a lesson that reshaped their understanding of power forever. The same men who had once sworn loyalty to a dictator would later speak of democracy with newfound respect. As the years passed and West Germany began to rebuild, a few of these former officers became voices of moderation. They lectured young soldiers on morality in warfare, on the dangers of blind obedience, and on the value of human dignity. It was ironic, almost poetic. Men who once fought against freedom had become its unlikely advocates. Not all changed, of course. Some clung to bitterness or denial. But the overall legacy of their experience was clear. The moral conduct of the United States during and after the war had planted a seed, one that would grow into the democratic, self-critical Germany that exists today. Even decades later, when asked what shocked them most about their captivity, many of the surviving generals gave the same answer. Not the defeat, not the loss of power, but the mercy. "We expected the Americans to hang us," one said. "Instead, they showed us what civilization meant." That, perhaps, is the real victory of the story. Not the battles won on the fields of Europe, but the victory of humanity over vengeance. The moment when compassion proved stronger than hate. In the ashes of war, it wasn't the bullet or the bomb that defined the future. It was the hand that chose not to strike back. And that's where our story ends. A story not of conquest, but of conscience. If you've reached this point of the story, thank you for listening to this powerful chapter of history. It reminds us that true strength isn't found in domination or cruelty. It's found in restraint, in justice, and in the courage to be human, even toward your enemies. If you enjoyed this storytelling, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from World War II and beyond. Your support helps keep this journey through history alive, one story at a time. Until next time, signing off. Stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, even in the darkest times, decency can still light the way.